Hello everyone, nice to meet you. I'm Dr. Huiyong from China. I'm very grateful to Professor Asong for providing me with such an opportunity to share with you something about Chinese comics. I once visited Complutense University when Professor Asong gave me great support and help. I had also participated in her courses before, and I deeply admire her efforts for cultural communication between the East and the West. So I'm very glad to have the privilege to give a lecture here. What I'm going to introduce to you today is Chinese comics. China has a comparatively short history of modern comics. Basically, we can divide Chinese comics into two different categories: political comics and entertaining comics. So let's come to the first part, political comics. From 1840 to 1949, China was precarious because of all kinds of internal problems and external invasions. Political comics began to appear in Chinese journalism and newspapers. It is widely accepted that the earliest comic is The Situation in the Far East by Xie Zantai, published in Hong Kong's journal 辅仁文社社刊 in 1898, which reflected the imperialist partition of China in a metaphorical form. Later, in 1903, there was a new version. This one is a new version. There was a new version of this painting, and we can see clearly that the painter, used different animals referring to different invaders. Look here. So this map, in both of the pictures, this map is the map of China, and these animals referred to different countries, different nations that conquered different parts of China. This bear refers to Russia, the dog here to the UK, the frog to France, the eagle to the US, the sun to Japan, and the sausage to Germany. From then on, Chinese comics were closely related to politics. In different historical stages, it focused on different topics. In the Revolution, the Chinese comics focused on the political movement. So, in 1911, there was a new culture movement in China, and in this movement, there were these comics focused on political movement. In the Civil War, in 1930s, in the Civil War, it expressed different ideas, different political ideas, look here, and described the ordinary people's lives. In the anti-Japanese war, it fought against the invader and the corrupted governments. So the painters used these comics as weapons, fighting against the invaders and corrupted governments. In the War of Liberation, it pursued democracy and freedom and peace. Okay, the works during these times got extensive social influence. After the foundation of the People's Republic of China in 1949, Chinese comics entered a new period of development. On the one hand, eulogizing comics are very popular. Comics, like all other cultural products, began to sing high praise for the new nation and the new government. On the other hand, comics also cooperated with various movements, such as the Agrarian Revolution, Socialist Construction, and the anti-racist struggle, the Cultural Revolution, and so on. So here I also have some pictures of the comics about the political movements and the political ideas. Comics played an active role in intervening in social lives. It became prosperous, but with a certain political motive. It was sometimes exaggerating, irrational, and even harmful. Such a situation only changed after the Cultural Revolution ended in 1976, and then comics got a new and healthful development ever since. Looking back at the history of Chinese political comics, we can find some certain characteristics, like fighting spirit, national artistic style, lack of industrialized cooperation. About the fighting spirit, since its beginning, Chinese comics have faced anti-imperialist wars, anti-feudal wars, and the Cultural Revolution. So it is full of fighting spirit and closely related to certain ideologies. About the national artistic style, although the styles of Chinese comics are diverse, they are deeply influenced by traditional Chinese artistic style. We can clearly see the Chinese folk art traditions in all these comics. The paintings mostly use the traditional Chinese ink and the wash lines, with a strong sense of traditional Chinese painting, coupled with the printing method of lithograph, which better conveys the charm of traditional brush pen and ink of China. Western painters would directly embed content titles and large paragraphs of text into the screen, while the Chinese comics words often appeared in the form of poems or inscriptions. This one is a typical one. And about the lack of industrialized cooperation. Before 1980s, China did not form an industrialized operation in comics. Political comics, as a tool of political struggle in modern times, are less affected by market-oriented factors, and the economic benefits derived from them had not received attention and development. Due to the lack of industrialization and the limitation of technology, the economic conditions, the value of the comic industry clusters had not been realized until the 1980s. The Chinese began to study from the comic industry in the United States and Japan. And we also know that the political comics declined together with the newspapers and other traditional medium. So here is the second category of Chinese comics, the entertaining comics. Actually, this type of comics appeared almost as early as political comics in China. But because of the social environment, it did not get the same attention. Representative authors are Feng Zikai, Shen Bochen, and others. Their entertaining comics focused on nature lives and emotions. So this one is a portrait of Feng Zikai, and let's have a look at some of his comics. This one, it's very beautiful. His comics are so different from American comics and Japanese comics. Their entertaining comics focused on nature lives and emotions, greatly influenced by traditional Chinese paintings. After the People's Republic of China was founded in 1949, the nation was in a peaceful and stable status, and the entertaining comics prospered. The comics of 1950s obviously had an educational function. That is, the content of the works always appeared with a strong educational significance, and young people are regarded as an important target group. And cartoon movies also developed rapidly. The comics and animation creation since the founding of New China has long been related to the political themes of the times, causing the authors to habitually regard comics and animation as the main medium for the spread of political ideas, and the audience is mainly defined as children and adolescents. So here we have some comic books of that times. We can see that in some of the elements of the educational purpose, educational orientation, educational elements exist in all cultures. In traditional Chinese society, education is more valued, more systematic, and more prosperous. And the emphasis on self-cultivation is very important. Real themes and fairy tales were very important in Chinese entertaining comics in these times because of the characteristics of traditional Chinese education. Comics were not just for getting a laugh, but the real purpose was to gain educational significance from joyful laughter. The mutual promotion of education and self-cultivation reflect Chinese traditional values. A very famous Chinese story. In this one, we can find a very famous Chinese story which has been passed down for 1,000 years. Praised a 5-year-old boy voluntarily giving away bigger pears to his brothers. This tradition is so powerful that even in 1980s, the orientation of education was still the biggest feature of Chinese comics. While reading the comics, the children need to understand the current situation of the times and the society, understand good and evil, and learn the social values. It is no exaggeration to say that Chinese comics from the 1960s to 1980s was an art that served the traditional educational purpose. It was never purely entertaining, but comparatively serious, and the style was still traditional. A very important example was Havoc in Heaven. This is a cartoon movie. It was also translated as Uproar in Heaven, which is a Chinese cartoon movie. The movie was created as the hit of the Chinese animation industry in the 1960s. This one. It earned domestic and international praise. The story is an adaptation of the earlier episodes of the 16th century Chinese novel Journey to the West. The main character is Sun Wukong, aka the Monkey King, who rebels against the Jade Emperor of Heaven. So I have shown you these 3 pictures, and the last one is the picture of a comic book of the same title. In this movie and the relevant comic books, the Chinese traditional culture were perfectly expressed, which made it reach the pinnacle of nationalized artistic style and became a cultural symbol. The Chinese regarded the fighting of the Monkey King as a symbol of the working people fighting against the feudal society. So the spirit of a fight was highlighted. This image was so successful that it influenced all the later images of the Monkey King. In decades, all Monkey Kings looked just like this one, with the following features. Look here. A face like a peach or a red heart, green eyebrow, a yellow tied top, a green scarf, a leopard skin skirt, red pants, and black boots, all closely related to Beijing opera. The design of Monkey King in terms of details and the proportions are mature, with distinct national features. All these images have portrayed Monkey King as a fearless revolutionary hero. This is undoubtedly related to the political and cultural context of the time. After the founding of New China, Havoc in Heaven was more like a glorious memory of revolutionary history, praising Monkey King's revolutionary spirit of resistance, and ultimately succeeded. The core value of these early images of the Monkey King was more of a political sense and a national significance, and the Monkey King was portrayed as a god that we worship and a hero that we follow. However, as the times changed, the mainstream ideology can no longer dominate the whole society. American comics and Japanese comics brought huge impacts. Since 1990s, we can find in some later movies that the Monkey Kings were portrayed in almost the same image, just like the one in the movie Havoc in Heaven. However, as the times changed, the mainstream ideology can no longer dominate the whole society. American comics and Japanese comics brought huge impacts. Since the 1990s, the Chinese comics gradually let go of the burden of education. In contrast between the elite and the masses, the center and the peripheries, and the mainstream and the non-mainstream. The cultural significance of comics had also shifted from unity to pluralism. In 1999, a new cartoon movie, Lotus Lantern, was released. This one is taken from this movie. In this movie, the Monkey King was only a minor role, looking elderly, talking endlessly, and full of complaints. Still a hero, but not perfect. This time the Monkey King is just a person with shortcomings and humanity. Then, in 2015, another movie, Monkey King Hero is Back, was released, in which Monkey King was depicted as a depressed middle-aged figure with complex emotion, and there was a depiction of an affection similar to father and son. This is to unearth more human expressions in the character of Monkey King, which also makes this hero more flesh and blood, and the image is a great innovation. Monkey King does not have a peach-hearted face now, but a long horse face. This horse-faced monkey is far from the image of the Monkey King in our memory. Then one set of Monkey King's costume is ordinary martial arts costumes, and another is his gorgeous armor. So the Monkey King is a typical example in the changes of the comics. This change shows that since the 1980s and 1990s, the Chinese have been more inclined to see heroic images with flaws and personality. Disenchantment made the hero get off the altar. The audience are more willing to see the characters in ordinary life, and they do not like the heroes to be didactic. This is also the influence of the postmodernism on culture. The latest cartoon movies are industrialized and influenced by American and Japanese comic cultures and industries. But because of the strict censorship in China, the movies and the published comics are still showing positive values and educational elements to some extent. The most radical change happened in the Internet. Television, Internet, and other new media forms have extended the ways of comic dissemination. Comics in this era emphasize the spirit of free creation, oppose the oppression of any mainstream discourse, oppose the orthodox and paradigm of artistic beauty, and emphasize the casualness of comic creation. It emphasizes the openness of creative content and opposes all authority and the mainstream obstruction of comic creation. Thus, the subcultural and postmodern characteristics in comic works are becoming more and more obvious. A typical example is the Ridge comics. Introduced into China in 2008, Ridge Comics is a new type of open comics popular on the Internet. The special template model and the simple and crude drawing style made it possible to be produced and published by grassroots netizens who have no artistic skills. The basic form of Ridge Comics is to express the daily mood of the painter through exaggerated portraits, usually ridge and speechlessness. Let's look at some of the typical figures. This one, the Ridge comics, very popular in China. So it is also an important symbol of the youth subculture on the Internet, deconstructing mainstream values and ideologies such as aesthetic standards, orthodox discourse, grand narratives, and authoritative classics in the coarse subcultural style of parody, joking, and self-depreciating. It deconstructed the mainstream culture in a way of rebellion and dissolution. So now we have seen some types of comics in China, and we can have a brief conclusion. Oh, this is another picture of Ridge comics. So, and a brief conclusion. The history of modern comics in China covered more than 100 years and many historical stages. But the two most important demarcations are the founding of the People's Republic of China in 1949 and the reform and opening up after 1978. Generally speaking, Chinese comics are characterized by strong political elements and ideological characteristics in the early stage, and a rapid development after comic industrialization in the later stage. But with the industrialization, it still shows the puerile characteristics. It is difficult for comics in mainstream media to break away from moralizing. And it is comparatively superficial in depth. Chinese comics industry is not as developed as of the United States and Japan. So Chinese comics lack fierce conflicts, grand and profound themes, and distinctive character designs. In addition, the Internet has also greatly promoted the development of comics in China. So it has begun to show a tendency of diversification and some characteristics of postmodernity. This is only a very brief introduction to the history of Chinese comics. The history of Chinese comics is much more complex than what I have shown you here in 30 minutes. I hope we can have a further discussion sometime. Thank you very much for your attention.